The arrival of shadows. It was a damp summer evening in the small town of Brampton, Alabama, a place seemingly stuck in time, where old values lingered like stubborn cobwebs in the corners of an aging room. Officer Jack Morgan, a man of medium build with a rigid posture and piercing blue eyes, patrolled the sleepy streets in his cruiser. Jack took pride in knowing every inch of Brampton, every potholed street, every rickety house, and most importantly, every familiar face. The town was quiet tonight, with only the occasional shuffle of a raccoon in an overturned garbage bin or the distant hum of a freight train passing through the outskirts. Jack relished these moments of stillness. They affirmed his belief that he was the protector of Brampton's fragile order. However, tonight was different. Something gnawed at him, a lingering restlessness in the pit of his stomach. It was nearing dusk when Jack noticed an unfamiliar vehicle, a sleek black Tesla with chrome rims, sliding gracefully through the narrow streets. The car seemed out of place in Brampton, a town where battered pickup trucks and aging sedans were the norm. As it glided past the local diner, Jack caught a glimpse of the driver, a tall, dark-skinned man wearing a crisp navy blue suit and a watch that sparkled under the dying sunlight. Jack's hands instinctively tightened on the wheel. His mind raced with questions. Who was this man? Why was he here? The uneasy restlessness in Jack's guts swelled into a burning need to investigate. He trailed the car at a cautious distance, his cruiser blending into the shadows. The Tesla turned onto a residential street, one lined with tidy lawns and old houses that whispered stories of generations past. Jack didn't need much reason. He'd already made up his mind. With a flick of his hand, he activated his siren, its sharp wail shattering the tranquil evening. The Tesla pulled to the curb without hesitation, its smooth compliance only fueling Jack's suspicion. He parked behind it, stepping out with deliberate slowness, his hand grazing the butt of his holstered gun. Jack's boots crunched against the gravel as he approached the driver's window, his eyes narrowing as he took in the man behind the wheel. The driver rolled down his window, revealing a calm and composed face. His dark eyes held Jack's gaze, unflinching. "Good evening, officer," the man said, his voice deep and measured. He offered a polite nod, his movements deliberate and poised. "License and registration," Jack demanded curtly, ignoring the pleasantry. He studied the man's tailored suit, the sleekness of the car, the quiet confidence in his demeanor. All of it irritated him in ways he couldn't quite articulate. The man handed over his documents without hesitation. His name read Jonathan Devereux. "What brings you to this part of town, Mr. Devereux?" Jack asked, his tone laced with thinly veiled suspicion. "I'm here visiting family," Jonathan replied evenly. "Is there a problem, officer?" Jack's jaw tightened. The man's calm demeanor felt like a challenge, a dismissal of the authority Jack held so dearly. "This vehicle registered to you?" he asked, holding up the registration papers. Jonathan nodded. "Yes, officer, it is." Jack scanned the papers, searching for any discrepancy. But everything was in order. Clean record, current registration. Yet he couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The confidence radiating from Jonathan seemed to erode Jack's sense of control. "You mind stepping out of the car?" Jack asked, his voice firm. Jonathan's eyebrows rose slightly, but he complied, exiting the vehicle with the same measured grace. He stood tall, his presence commanding despite the simmering tension in the air. "May I ask why you've stopped me?" Jonathan asked, his voice calm but with a distinct edge of firmness. Jack straightened, his height barely meeting Jonathan's shoulder. "You were driving through a residential area in a high-end car. Seemed unusual." "Unusual," Jonathan echoed, his tone sharp but still controlled. "Since when is driving through a neighborhood unusual, officer?" Jack's fists clenched. He felt his authority slipping, his assumptions crumbling under the weight of Jonathan's quiet defiance. The unease grew, twisting into frustration. He took a step closer, invading Jonathan's personal space. "Look," Jack snapped, "I'll be the one asking the questions here. Hands behind your back." Jonathan hesitated for a fraction of a second, his jaw tightening, but he complied. Jack pulled out his cuffs, securing them around Jonathan's wrists with a force that spoke of his fraying control. The metal clicked loudly, each snap echoing in the growing crowd of onlookers. From the corner of his eye, Jack noticed a young woman clutching her phone, recording the encounter. His stomach tightened. This was supposed to be a routine stop, yet now it felt like something more, a moment slipping beyond his control. "You're making a mistake," Jonathan said quietly, his voice steady despite the circumstances. "I'd advise you to look closely at who you're dealing with." Jack sneered, ignoring the warning. "Don't care who you are," he replied, shoving Jonathan toward his cruiser. "You don't belong here." As he placed Jonathan in the back seat, Jack caught the man's eyes in the rearview mirror. There was no fear, no submission, only a calm, piercing gaze that sent an unsettling chill through him. Jack drove to the station in silence, the weight of his actions beginning to settle over him like a storm cloud. He hadn't found anything incriminating, nothing to justify the arrest. Yet he'd acted on an unspoken instinct, a quiet, deeply rooted belief that he now feared he couldn't justify. As he parked at the station, his heart thudded heavily. Jack knew the night was far from over, but he couldn't have foreseen how quickly the tides were about to turn, and how Jonathan Devereux's true identity would unravel the delicate fabric of his authority. A name that echoes. Jack Morgan's pulse quickened as he entered the station, Jonathan Devereux walking steadily in front of him, hands cuffed behind his back. The station was a modest building, old beige walls with scuffed floors and flickering fluorescent lights. Usually, it felt like a fortress to Jack, a place where he ruled with unyielding authority. Tonight, though, the atmosphere felt heavy, each step deeper into the precinct amplifying the unease simmering in his chest. Officers at their desks paused mid-conversation to look up as Jack and Jonathan entered. There was no mistaking the tension in their stares, some curious, others skeptical, and a few tinged with disbelief. The murmurs started almost immediately, whispers trailing them like a shadow as Jack led Jonathan to the booking desk. Behind the desk sat Officer Linda Walker, her face betraying a flicker of confusion as she took in the sharply dressed man in cuffs. Jack could see the hesitation in her hand as it hovered over the booking forms. "Charges?" Linda asked, her voice cautious as she glanced between Jack and Jonathan. "Suspicion of illegal activity," Jack replied sharply, avoiding Jonathan's calm, assessing gaze. Linda's brow furrowed. "Illegal activity," she echoed. "What kind of activity?" Jack hesitated, the flimsy foundation of his decision crumbling beneath him. "He was acting suspiciously," he said, his voice lower now. Even to his own ears, the justification sounded weak. Jonathan remained silent, his expression composed but watchful. He stood tall, his posture immaculate, as though daring the room to question his presence. That quiet defiance made Jack's irritation boil beneath the surface. Linda's gaze lingered on Jonathan, her lips pressing into a thin line. "I'll need to see his ID," she said, her tone professional but tinged with unease. Jack pulled Jonathan's wallet from his pocket and handed over the ID. Linda scanned the name, and her eyes widened slightly. She froze, staring at the name for a moment too long before looking up at Jonathan with a mix of recognition and disbelief. "Wait, Jonathan Devereux," she said softly, the name slipping past her lips like an unspoken revelation. The room seemed to tilt in that moment. Jack frowned, sensing the shift, but not fully understanding it. He glanced at Linda, whose demeanor had changed entirely. Her professionalism now gave way to visible discomfort. "Is there a problem?" Jack asked, his irritation flaring. Linda looked up at him, her expression uneasy. "Jack, are you aware of who this is?" she asked, her voice low but firm. Jack's frustration swelled. "Should I?" he snapped. "I stopped him because he was acting suspiciously." Before Linda could respond, the station door swung open, and a tall, middle-aged man in a dark gray suit strode in. His presence was commanding, his expression tense. He carried an air of authority that turned heads immediately. Jack recognized him as Chief Michael Grant, the head of the Brampton Police Department. Chief Grant's sharp gaze swept the room, landing squarely on Jonathan. His jaw tightened before his eyes flicked to Jack, his expression darkening. Without a word, he motioned for Jack to follow him to his office. Jonathan, still silent, watched them go, his calm demeanor unshaken. Jack felt the man's eyes boring into his back as he walked away, leaving an uncomfortable knot in his stomach. Inside the chief's office, the atmosphere was suffocating. Grant shut the door with more force than necessary and turned to Jack, his face a storm of suppressed anger. "Do you have any idea what you've done?" Grant began, his voice low and dangerous. Jack bristled, his pride instinctively rising to defend himself. "I was doing my job, sir." He was acting suspiciously, driving an expensive car in a neighborhood he... "Stop," Grant interrupted, holding up an hand. "Just stop." Jack swallowed hard, the sharp edge of Grant's tone cutting through his defenses. The chief stepped behind his desk and leaned forward, his hands gripping the edge tightly. "Jonathan Devereux is not some random guy in a suit," Grant said slowly, enunciating every word. "He's a federal judge, a highly respected one. He's presided over some of the most high-profile civil rights cases in the region." The words hit Jack like a physical blow. He felt the air leave his lungs as the weight of his actions sank in. A federal judge. The man he'd cuffed and brought into the station without cause was one of the most powerful legal figures in the state. "Sir, I didn't know," Jack began, but Grant cut him off again. "That's the problem, Morgan," Grant barked, his voice rising. "You didn't know, but you acted anyway. You acted on assumptions. You didn't bother to think about what this could mean. For him, for this department, for this entire town." Jack's chest tightened. His mind raced, scrambling for a way to salvage the situation, but every potential excuse sounded hollow, pathetic. He built his career on the idea of control, on the belief that his authority was absolute. Now it felt like that belief was slipping through his fingers. "You've put us in a terrible position," Grant continued, his voice quieter now, but no less forceful. "Judge Devereux isn't just going to let this slide. He doesn't have to. He's got the connections, the resources, and frankly, the moral high ground to take this all the way." Jack felt the cold truth of those words settle over him. He thought back to Jonathan's calm demeanor, the quiet confidence that had irritated him so much. Now he understood it. Jonathan hadn't been afraid because he didn't need to be. He held all the cards, and Jack had handed them to him on a silver platter. "What do we do now?" Jack asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Grant leaned back in his chair, his expression grim. "For starters, you're going to apologize. To him, to the community, and to this department. And you'd better mean it, Morgan, because this isn't just about your career. It's about what we represent. Do you understand?" Jack nodded numbly, the full weight of his actions pressing down on him. His authority, his pride, his carefully constructed identity as Brampton's protector. It all felt fragile now, like a house of cards ready to collapse. As he left the chief's office, Jack felt the stares of his colleagues once more. Their whispers followed him down the hall, their judgment heavy in the air. When he returned to the booking area, Jonathan was sitting calmly on the bench, his hands still cuffed but his posture as composed as ever. Jack hesitated for a moment, then approached slowly. He reached for the cuffs, his hands trembling slightly as he unlocked them. Jonathan stood, adjusting his suit with the same quiet grace he'd shown all evening. "I'm sorry," Jack said, his voice barely audible. Jonathan met his gaze, his expression unreadable. For a moment, the two men stood in silence, the tension between them palpable. "This isn't about me, Officer Morgan," Jonathan said finally, his voice steady. "This is about the choices you make, the assumptions you carry, and the people they hurt. You need to think about that." With that, Jonathan walked out of the station, leaving Jack standing alone, the weight of his words echoing in the empty space around him. The fallout. The sun rose reluctantly over Brampton the next morning, casting a pale, watery light over the town. Jack Morgan sat on the edge of his bed, his face buried in his hands. He hadn't slept, not truly. Instead, he'd lain awake replaying the events of the previous night, the tension in his chest deepening with each passing hour. Laura, his wife, stood in the doorway, watching him. Her arms were crossed, and her face wore an expression Jack hadn't seen before, disappointment tinged with something heavier, disbelief. "Jack," she began, her voice quiet but firm, "what are they saying about you?" He lifted his head, meeting her gaze. For a moment, the stoic mask he always wore cracked, revealing the exhaustion and shame beneath. "It's all over the station," he admitted. "And the chief made it clear this isn't going away anytime soon." Laura exhaled sharply, shaking her head. "I saw it on the local news this morning," she said. "A federal judge, Jack. You arrested a federal judge because you thought he didn't belong here. Do you even hear yourself?" Jack's jaw tightened. He opened his mouth to respond but stopped short. What could he say? That he was following his instincts, that he thought he was protecting the community. The excuses sounded feeble even in his own mind. "I made a mistake," he said finally, his voice hoarse. "I didn't know who he was." Laura's eyes narrowed. And if he hadn't been a judge, would that have made it okay? Her question hung in the air like a weight, heavy and unavoidable. Jack felt his stomach twist as the truth of her words hit him. The position of power Jonathan Devereaux held shouldn't have mattered. It shouldn't have taken a title or a reputation to make Jack question his actions. "You've always been so proud of your badge," Laura continued, her voice soft but cutting. "But that badge isn't a license to act on your biases. You humiliated a man, Jack, a man who spent his life fighting for justice, and you treated him like a criminal because of the way he looked." Jack dropped his gaze, unable to face her. He built his identity around his role as an officer, as someone who upheld order and justice. Now that identity felt hollow, exposed as a facade. "What happens now?" Laura asked after a long pause. Jack rubbed his hands over his face, the roughness of his palms grounding him. "The chief wants me to apologize," he said, publicly, "and I'll be reassigned. Community outreach, probably. It's damage control." Laura nodded slowly, her expression unreadable. "Do it," she said firmly. "And don't just do it because it's what they're telling you to do. Do it because it's the right thing to do." Her words carried a finality that left no room for argument. Jack nodded, though his chest felt heavy. As Laura walked away, he was left alone with the silence of the house, the weight of his mistakes pressing down on him. At the station, the tension was palpable. Jack felt the stares of his colleagues as he walked through the precinct. Conversations stopped as he passed, replaced by whispered exchanges that prickled at the edges of his hearing. Linda Walker approached him near the break room, her expression guarded. "The chief wants to see you," she said. Jack nodded, his throat tightening. He knew what this was about. The apology, the fallout, the reckoning. When he entered Chief Grant's office, the older man was seated behind his desk, his hands steepled in front of him. Next to him sat a woman Jack recognized from news reports, Evelyn Harris, a prominent civil rights attorney who had worked closely with Judge Devereaux on several high-profile cases. Her sharp gaze met Jack's, and he felt an immediate surge of unease. "Officer Morgan," Chief Grant began, his tone clipped. "This is Ms. Harris. She's here representing Judge Devereaux." Jack's pulse quickened, but he nodded respectfully. "Ma'am," he said, his voice strained. Evelyn studied him for a long moment before speaking. "Officer Morgan, I'll be direct. Judge Devereaux has made it clear he's not seeking personal retribution. What he wants, what we want, is accountability. This isn't just about you. It's about systemic issues that go far beyond one incident." Jack swallowed hard, the weight of her words sinking in. "I understand," he said, though he wasn't sure he truly did. Evelyn's gaze didn't waver. "Do you? Because this is your opportunity to show whether you're willing to learn from this, or whether you're just looking to save face." The room fell silent, the gravity of her statements settling over them. Jack shifted uncomfortably under her scrutiny. "I want to make things right," he said finally, his voice low. "I don't know how, but I do." Evelyn nodded slowly. "Then you'll make a public apology," she said, "not just to Judge Devereaux, but to the community you've wronged. You'll also commit to participating in training on racial bias and community relations, and you'll work directly with outreach programs in the neighborhoods you've neglected. This isn't optional." Jack hesitated, the words feeling like a heavy chain being placed around his neck. But he nodded. "I'll do it," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Chief Grant's expression softened slightly, though his tone remained firm. "Good. The press conference is scheduled for tomorrow morning. I suggest you spend tonight preparing." Jack left the office feeling like the walls of the precinct were closing in on him. The murmurs of his colleagues followed him as he walked to his desk. The weight of their judgment was almost unbearable, but what stunned more was the realization that they weren't entirely wrong. That evening, Jack sat alone in his kitchen, staring at a blank notepad. The words he needed to say wouldn't come. How could he apologize for something so deeply rooted in his own flaws? How could he convince anyone, let alone himself, that he was capable of change? He thought about Jonathan Devereaux, about the quiet strength in his eyes during their confrontation. He thought about Laura's disappointment, about the way her words had cut through him with painful precision. And he thought about his badge, now sitting on the table in front of him. Its weight a reminder of the responsibility he'd failed to uphold. Jack picked up the pen, his hand trembling as he began to write. The words came slowly, haltingly, each one feeling like an admission of guilt he wasn't sure he was ready to face. But as the minutes passed, the page began to fill, and with it, the faintest glimmer of clarity. He didn't know if an apology would be enough. He didn't know if he could ever regain the trust he'd lost. But he knew one thing. This was the first step. And he had no choice but to take it. The public reckoning. The morning of the press conference dawned gray and overcast, as if the skies themselves bore the weight of the day's gravity. Jack Morgan stood in front of the full-length mirror in his modest bedroom, adjusting the collar of his uniform. The familiar blue fabric, once a source of pride and authority, now felt like a shroud, a reminder of the responsibility he had betrayed. Laura appeared in the doorway, her face neutral, her arms crossed. She had said little to him that morning, but her presence was heavy with meaning. Jack glanced at her reflection in the mirror, searching for some sign of reassurance, but she gave none. She only nodded slightly, her lips pressed into a thin line. "You'd better mean what you say today, Jack," she said quietly. "Not just for them, but for yourself." Jack turned to face her, his shoulders sagging under the weight of her words. "I will," he said, though his voice lacked the conviction he wished it carried. She studied him for a moment longer before leaving him alone with his thoughts. The Brampton Town Hall was packed when Jack arrived. Reporters, local activists, and members of the community filled the room, their voices blending into a low hum of anticipation. Cameras were set up along the back wall, their lenses trained on the small stage at the front. Jack felt their presence like a physical weight, each one ready to capture every word, every expression, every misstep. The room quieted as the door opened and Judge Jonathan Devereaux entered, flanked by his attorney Evelyn Harris and Chief Michael Grant. Devereaux's presence was commanding as ever, his tall frame and composed demeanor immediately drawing attention. He scanned the room briefly, his eyes landing on Jack for a moment before moving on. The look wasn't hostile, but it wasn't forgiving either. It was assessing, as if measuring Jack's capacity for sincerity. Jack's stomach twisted as he took his place at the podium. The silence in the room was deafening, the eyes of the crowd piercing. He cleared his throat, the sound unnaturally loud in the stillness. "My name is Officer Jack Morgan," he began, his voice strained. and I am here today to take full responsibility for my actions." He paused, the weight of the moment pressing down on him. His prepared speech lay crumpled in his pocket, useless now. What he had written the night before felt hollow, disconnected from the raw emotion of the room. Instead, he decided to speak from the heart, however broken it might be. "A few nights ago," he continued, "I made a choice that I now see for what it was, an act of prejudice and ignorance. I stopped and detained Judge Jonathan Devereux, not because of any evidence of wrongdoing, but because of my own assumptions. I saw a man who didn't fit the image I had in my mind of who belongs in this town, and I acted on that assumption." A murmur rippled through the crowd, a mixture of disbelief and anger. Jack swallowed hard, forcing himself to meet their gaze. "What I did was wrong," he said, his voice steadying. "It was wrong not just because of who Judge Devereux is, but because of what it says about me, about the biases I've carried without questioning them. I violated his rights. I humiliated him. And I betrayed the trust of this community." The murmurs grew louder, but Jack pressed on. "I am not here to ask for forgiveness. I am here to acknowledge the harm I've caused and to commit to doing better. Not just for Judge Devereux, but for every person in this community who has felt the sting of prejudice and injustice." He turned to face Jonathan directly. "Judge Devereux, I am deeply sorry for the way I treated you. You deserved better. This community deserves better." The judge studied him for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Jack felt the silence stretch out, each second an eternity. Finally, Devereux stepped forward, his calm voice cutting through the tension. "Thank you, Officer Morgan," he said. "But words alone are not enough. Apologies are a starting point, not an end point. What matters now is what you do moving forward." He turned to address the crowd. "This is not just about one officer or one incident. It's about a system that allows assumptions and biases to dictate how people are treated. It's about challenging that system and holding ourselves, and each other, accountable." The room erupted in applause, though it wasn't for Jack. It was for the judge, for his eloquence and his steadfastness. Jack stepped back from the podium, his face flushed. He felt small, insignificant, but also strangely relieved. The apology was out. The weight of it was no longer entirely his to bear. The next few hours were a blur. Reporters cornered him as he left the building, their questions coming fast and sharp. "Do you think you deserve to keep your badge?" one asked. "What steps are you taking to address your biases?" asked another. Jack answered as best he could, but the words felt inadequate. He wasn't sure if he deserved to keep his badge. He wasn't sure if he even wanted to. But he knew he had to try to make amends, however long that process might take. Back at the station, the atmosphere was tense. Some of his colleagues avoided him entirely, while others offered awkward words of encouragement that rang hollow. The chief called him into his office for a private conversation. "You did the right thing today," Grant said, his tone measured. "But this is just the beginning. You've got a long road ahead, Morgan, and it's going to be uncomfortable." Jack nodded. "I understand, sir." "Good," Grant said. "Because if you stumble even once, this department won't hesitate to hold you accountable." Jack left the office feeling both relieved and apprehensive. He had survived the public reckoning, but he knew the hardest part was yet to come, proving to himself, to his family, and to the community that he could change. That evening, Jack returned home to find Laura waiting for him in the living room. She didn't speak at first, simply motioned for him to sit beside her. The silence between them was heavy but not hostile. "You did better than I expected," she said finally, her voice soft. Jack looked at her, his throat tight. "Do you think I can fix this?" Laura's gaze softened, though her eyes were still filled with caution. "I think you can try," she said. "And that's a start." For the first time in days, Jack felt a flicker of hope. It was small, fragile, but it was there. And he clung to it as he prepared for the long, uncertain journey ahead, confronting the unseen. The first days after the press conference were anything but easy. Jack Morgan's world, once a rigid and predictable structure, had fractured into unfamiliar terrain. His reassignment to the department's community outreach program placed him in the center of the very neighborhoods he'd once patrolled with a sense of authority and detachment. Now, as he walked the narrow streets and visited community centers, he was no longer Officer Morgan, the enforcer. He was Jack, the man trying to piece together the shards of a broken trust. Monday morning, a new beginning. The outreach office was a far cry from the precinct Jack had known. Tucked into a modest brick building near the town's west side, it was a vibrant, chaotic hub filled with voices, laughter, and the occasional frustrated outburst. Posters advocating equality, education, and opportunity lined the walls, alongside photos of community events and milestones. Jack entered hesitantly, his uniform feeling conspicuously out of place among the casually dressed volunteers and social workers. A young woman with curly hair pulled into a ponytail greeted him with a skeptical glance. "You're the cop they sent over?" she asked, her voice sharp. Jack nodded. "That's me." She folded her arms, her expression unreadable. "Name's Tasha. I run the mentorship program here. Let me guess. This is your version of penance." Jack flinched but held her gaze. "I'm here to learn," he said simply, "and to help, if I can." Tasha studied him for a moment, then shrugged. "We'll see about that. Follow me." First assignment, listening and learning. Tasha led Jack to a room where a group of teenagers sat in a circle, their voices blending into a low hum of chatter. They fell silent as Jack entered, their eyes narrowing with suspicion. Tasha gestured for him to sit, and he took a seat awkwardly, the plastic chair creaking under his weight. "Everyone, this is Jack," Tasha said. "He's going to be shadowing us for a while. Go easy on him." The teens exchanged glances, a mix of amusement and distrust flashing across their faces. One boy, tall and wiry with a defiant gaze, leaned forward. "So, you're the cop who messed up?" he asked bluntly. Jack felt the room stiffen, the weight of their judgment bearing down on him. He nodded. "Yeah, I'm the one who messed up." The boy tilted his head, a flicker of surprise in his expression. "You gonna tell us why?" Jack took a deep breath, the air feeling heavy in his lungs. "Because I made a choice without thinking. I saw someone who didn't fit into the narrow picture I had in my head, and I acted on that instead of questioning myself." The room was silent, the teens watching him intently. Jack felt their eyes prodding for cracks in his sincerity. "And now?" another teen asked, her voice quieter, but no less pointed. "And now I'm here to understand," Jack replied. "I know I can't fix what I did, but I want to do better. To see things the way they really are, not the way I assumed they were." For a moment, no one spoke. Then the wiry boy leaned back, crossing his arms. "All right, Jack. Let's see what you're made of." The neighborhood walk. Later that week, Tasha took Jack on a walk through the community, pointing out landmarks, local businesses, and areas in need of improvement. As they passed a corner store, an older man sitting on the steps called out, "Hey, Officer Morgan." His tone was laced with mockery. "Lost your squad car." Jack stopped, turning to face the man. He was wiry and weathered, his face lined with years of hard living. His name was Carl, a figure well known in the community, Tasha explained, for both his wisdom and his sharp tongue. "Not lost," Jack said evenly. "Just walking." Carl chuckled. "Walking? Ha! That's new. Guess you're seeing what it's like down here without the sirens." Jack nodded, resisting the urge to defend himself. "I am. And I know I've got a lot to learn." Carl's laughter faded, replaced by a long, scrutinizing stare. "Good," he said finally, "because this place isn't just a bad part of town. It's home. And if you're serious about making amends, you'd better start seeing it that way." A shared story. As the days turned into weeks, Jack found himself drawn to the stories of the people he met. There was Jamal, a former mechanic who ran a youth boxing club out of a converted garage to keep kids off the streets. There was Maria, a single mother juggling 2 jobs and organizing a community garden to teach her children about sustainability. And there was Carl, whose sharp wit belied a deep well of knowledge about the town's history and struggles. One afternoon, Carl invited Jack to sit with him on the corner steps. The old man lit a cigarette, exhaling a plume of smoke as he regarded Jack thoughtfully. "You ever think about what makes a good cop?" Carl asked. Jack hesitated. "Someone who serves and protects." Carl snorted. "That's what they teach you in training. But serving and protecting ain't enough if you don't know who you're serving or what you're protecting them from." He gestured to the bustling street. "This neighborhood, it's got its problems, sure, but it's also got pride, community, history, people like me. We've been here long before you showed up, and we'll be here long after. If you want to help, you gotta understand that." Jack nodded slowly, the weight of Carl's words sinking in. "I want to understand," he said, "and I want to earn back the trust I've lost." Carl took another drag of his cigarette, his eyes narrowing as he studied Jack. "We'll see if you mean that," he said. The first signs of change. The change was slow, almost imperceptible at first. Jack spent hours listening to the teens in the mentorship program, their stories revealing layers of struggle and resilience he had never considered. He worked alongside Tasha, helping to organize events and fundraisers, his hands growing calloused from the labor. He joined Carl on his steps every afternoon, soaking up the man's wisdom like a parched plant in desperate need of water. And slowly, the community began to respond. The glares softened into cautious nods. The whispers of distrust gave way to tentative conversations. Jack knew he wasn't forgiven, not yet, and maybe not ever, but he was no longer the outsider. He was part of something bigger than himself, something that demanded humility and effort every single day. One evening, as Jack walked home from the outreach center, he passed a mural being painted on the side of a building. It depicted a vibrant scene of unity and hope, with hands of all colors reaching toward a shared horizon. The artist, a young woman named Lila, looked up from her work and nodded to him. "Looks good," Jack said, stopping to admire the mural. Lila smiled faintly. "Thanks. It's for the neighborhood, to remind us of what we're working toward." Jack stood there for a moment, the weight of her words settling over him. He didn't say anything else, just nodded and continued on his way. For the first time in months, he felt a flicker of something he hadn't expected to find. Peace. It wasn't the kind of peace that came from absolution or certainty. It was the kind that came from knowing he was on the right path, however long and difficult it might be. And for now, that was enough. A new foundation. Months had passed since Jack Morgan's reassignment to the community outreach program, and the transformation was both slow and deeply personal. The man who once wore his badge like armor had begun to see it not as a symbol of authority, but as a tool for connection. Yet he knew that his journey was far from over. The town still watched him with cautious eyes, and the scars of his actions remained fresh in many hearts. This morning, as Jack walked into the outreach center, he noticed a new energy in the air. The upcoming town hall meeting, a forum to discuss ongoing community issues, had drawn significant attention, and with it, heightened expectations. Jack had been asked to speak, a prospect that filled him with both determination and trepidation. He knew this was another test, a chance to show that his words weren't just hollow promises. The morning of reckoning. The town hall was packed, its walls buzzing with the conversations of residents from every corner of Brampton. Jack recognized many faces. Carl, seated near the front with his ever-present cigarette tucked behind his ear. Tasha, standing by the door, her arms crossed as she surveyed the room. And even Laura, who had come with their daughter Lily. Jack hadn't expected Lily to be there, and the sight of her small face among the crowd sent a wave of emotion crashing through him. She was sitting quietly, her hands folded in her lap, but her wide eyes were locked on him. It was as if she, too, was waiting to see what kind of man her father had become. At the front of the room, Judge Jonathan Devereux stood speaking, his voice calm but commanding. He spoke about justice, about accountability, and about the need for meaningful change in the systems that shaped their lives. When we talk about accountability, Devereux said, we're not just talking about punishment. We're talking about transformation, about facing the hard truths and doing the work to rebuild what has been broken. The audience erupted into applause, the sound echoing off the walls. Jack swallowed hard, knowing it was his turn next. Jack's address. Jack stepped to the podium, the weight of the room pressing down on him like an ocean tide. He scanned the crowd, his eyes landing briefly on Laura and Lily before settling on Jonathan, whose calm expression was unreadable. He took a deep breath, gripping the edges of the podium to steady himself. "I don't deserve your trust yet," Jack began, his voice clear but laced with raw honesty. "I know that. Trust isn't something you can demand. It's something you earn, and I know I have a long way to go." The room was silent, the weight of his words sinking in. Jack continued, his voice steady but thick with emotion. "Several months ago, I made a choice rooted in prejudice. I acted on assumptions about someone I didn't know, assumptions that were not only wrong but deeply harmful. Judge Devereux has shown me more grace than I deserve, and this community has shown me more patience than I could have asked for." He paused, glancing briefly at Carl, who gave him the faintest nod of approval. "In these months, I've learned that understanding doesn't come from a place of power. It comes from listening, from being present, from allowing yourself to be vulnerable enough to admit that you were wrong." He glanced at Tasha, who watched him with arms still crossed, but with a glimmer of something softer in her eyes. "I've listened to your stories. I've walked your streets, and I've begun to see this community for what it is, not a problem to be solved, but a home filled with people who deserve respect, dignity, and fairness." The crowd remained silent, but Jack pressed on. "I know words aren't enough. That's why I've committed myself to this work, to being here, not as a badge, but as a person. I can't undo the harm I've caused, but I promise to continue to show up, to listen, and to learn. And maybe someday I'll earn back the trust I lost." When he finished, the room was silent for a beat that felt eternal. Then, to his surprise, Carl began to clap, the slow, deliberate sound breaking the tension. Others joined in, their applause hesitant at first, but growing louder. It wasn't a standing ovation, but it wasn't rejection either. It was a start, a private conversation. After the meeting, Jack found himself standing outside the town hall, the crisp evening air filling his lungs. He leaned against the railing, staring out at the dimly lit streets. The applause had meant something, but he knew it wasn't the end of his journey. It was simply another step. "Not bad," came a familiar voice. Jack turned to see Jonathan Devereux approaching, his hands in his pockets. The judge's expression was calm, but there was a hint of warmth in his eyes. "Thank you," Jack said, "for everything, for giving me this chance." Jonathan nodded. "You've come a long way, Jack, but the work doesn't end here." Jack met his gaze. "I know. I'm ready to keep going." Jonathan regarded him for a moment, then extended a hand. Jack hesitated before shaking it, the simple gesture carrying more weight than words ever could. A family moment. When Jack returned home that night, Laura and Lily were waiting for him in the living room. Laura's expression was softer than it had been in months, and Lily's face lit up when she saw him. "You did good, Dad," Lily said, her voice quiet but sincere. Jack knelt in front of her, his eyes level with hers. "Thank you, sweetheart. That means more to me than you know." Laura placed a hand on his shoulder, and for the first time in what felt like forever, Jack felt a glimmer of hope, not just for himself, but for his family and his future. Building something new. Over the following weeks, Jack continued his work in the community, his days filled with challenges and small victories. He helped organize a youth mentorship program with Tasha, partnered with Carl to host history talks about the neighborhood, and worked with Maria to expand the community garden. Each day, he felt himself growing, not as an officer, but as a person. And while the road ahead was still long, he walked it with a newfound sense of purpose. As Jack stood one evening watching the sunset over Brampton, he realized that redemption wasn't about erasing the past. It was about building something better, brick by brick, choice by choice. And for the first time in years, he felt like he was finally on solid ground. The turning point. Jack stood at the edge of the community garden, the evening sunlight casting a golden glow over the rows of vegetables and flowers. The air was filled with the faint hum of conversation as families tended to their plots, children laughing as they darted between the rows. It was a scene of peace and connection, a stark contrast to the tensions that had marked the past few months. Maria approached him, wiping her hands on a dirt-streaked towel. "You've been here every evening for the past week," she said, a smile tugging at the corners of her mouth. "Starting to feel like part of the family." Jack chuckled softly. "I'm trying," he admitted. "Still feels like I've got a lot to prove." Maria tilted her head, studying him. "Proving yourself takes time, but showing up, that's where it starts. And you've been showing up." Her words lingered with Jack as he helped stack tools and clean up for the day. He realized that these small moments, conversations in the garden, shared laughter with the teens at the mentorship program, learning from Carl's wealth of experience, were the foundation of something deeper. It wasn't about grand gestures or dramatic changes. It was about presence, consistency, humility. A long-awaited milestone. Weeks later, the mentorship program hosted its annual showcase, where the teens presented their projects and shared stories of their growth. Jack had been working closely with Tasha to prepare for the event, and the excitement was palpable as the community gathered in the local recreation center. The showcase was a resounding success. The teens spoke with confidence about their achievements, art installations, business ideas, community initiatives, and their pride was infectious. Jack stood at the back of the room, his heart swelling as he watched them thrive. As the evening wound down, the wiry boy from Jack's first day approached him. His name was Malcolm, and he had been one of the program's toughest critics. But tonight, there was something different in his demeanor. "You're all right, Officer Morgan," Malcolm said, his tone begrudging but genuine. "Didn't think I'd ever say that." Jack smiled, the weight of those words sinking in. "Thanks, Malcolm. That means a lot." Malcolm nodded, then leaned in conspiratorially. "But don't get too comfortable. You still have to beat me at basketball next week." Jack laughed, the sound light and free. "You're on." A family reunited. That weekend, Jack took Laura and Lily to the community garden, a place that had become his second home. Laura walked beside him, her arm brushing his, while Lily skipped ahead, her laughter ringing through the air. "You've changed," Laura said quietly as they watched Lily examine a bed of sunflowers. Jack turned to her, his expression thoughtful. "I had to. I didn't like who I was, and I didn't want Lily to grow up thinking that was the right way to be." Laura reached for his hand, her touch grounding him. "You're on the right path, Jack, and we're proud of you." Her words were a balm to his soul, and as he looked at his family, he felt a warmth he hadn't known in months. He knew the road ahead would still have its challenges, but he also knew he wouldn't face them alone. The end of the beginning. One quiet evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Jack found himself sitting with Carl on the familiar corner steps. Carl handed him a cold soda, the two of them sharing a companionable silence. "You've done good, kid," Carl said finally, his voice gruff. "Still a lot of work to do, but you've earned your place here." Jack nodded, his chest tightening with gratitude. "Thanks, Carl. That means more than you know." Carl smirked, taking a sip of his drink. "Don't get all sentimental on me. Just keep doing what you're doing." Jack smiled, leaning back against the steps and watching the world go by. For the first time in a long time, he felt at peace, not because the work was done, but because he finally understood what it meant to do it right. As the stars began to emerge in the night sky, Jack Morgan sat surrounded by the community he had once failed to see, knowing that every step forward was a step toward becoming the man he wanted to be. This wasn't the end of his journey. It was just the beginning of something new, something better. And for Jack, that was enough.